I'm not sure if you caught what I was just saying. I don't think it was working, so let me start over. I'm a professor at the Department of Communication at Western Washington University, which is in between Vancouver, BC and Seattle, Washington, right near the border here. And a lot of my work focuses on what I call the culture of contest, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a little bit. If you want to read a little more, my bio's on the ABS website, and otherwise I'd just as soon jump into the presentation. I'm going to try and keep my own comments down to about 30 minutes so that we have another half hour or so for questions and comments and what have you. If you want to register a question at any time, there's a button in front of you that says questions and answers. You can type in a question, and I think the moderator will put that on our screen after my presentation, so feel free to do that. So what I've been asked to speak about today is the question of whether or not competition is compatible with the principle of oneness. And in order to have this conversation, I think we need to begin by clarifying, first of all, what do I mean by the principle of oneness? So let's just think about this concept for a second. Many of you, I suspect, are very familiar with the Baha'i teachings. Some of you may not be, so I don't want to assume too much. But really the pivotal principle of the Baha'i faith is the oneness of humanity. And the Baha'i writings speak about this concept in a lot of depth with a lot of very rich language. I'm just going to throw a few very brief passages up on the screen so that we can sort of start with a general understanding of how I'm using the term oneness. Baha'u'llah has said, "He who is your Lord, the All-Merciful, cherisheth in his heart the desire of beholding the entire human race as one soul and one body." I think this very brief passage really encapsulates the concept or the principle of oneness. Baha'u'llah uses frequently throughout his writings the metaphor of society as being like a body, the human body as an analogy. So this is a degree of, I guess, organic integration and unity that is very central to the Baha'i conception of oneness. Abdu'l-Baha reinforces this same conception in his writings. For instance, this passage that asks us to regard ourselves as a member of a single corporeal form, a single body, really. And Shoghi Effendi similarly discusses the principle of oneness in considerable depth. This is a much larger passage I've taken this from, in which Shoghi Effendi articulates in quite a bit of detail the full implications of this concept or principle of oneness. But what I want to draw out is this idea that the principle of oneness implies an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. So it has to do with structural relationships within society, this principle. There'll be opportunity for us to look more deeply at this, but I just wanted to start with this very brief sort of sketch so we know what we're referring to. Now, similarly, we need to spend a minute and talk about what do we mean by competition if we're trying to look at the compatibility of these two. I've spent probably better part of the last 20 years studying, among other things, how people think and talk about competition and how it's ingrained in our behaviors and social norms and institutional structures. What I've come to see is really sort of four main elements or factors in the kind of equation of competition as it's generally understood today. The first of these is just self-interested rivalry. This is obviously at the heart of the modern understanding of competition. People pursuing for their own self-interested means or motives scarce resources or other opportunities that are limited, and hence they're competing for them. So whether they're competing for money, status, fame, a prize, scarce natural resources, this is obviously at the heart of competition, self-interested rivalry. But we can add to that the way competition is generally understood and expressed today, that this self-interested rivalry is coupled with a striving for excellence, creativity, productivity, innovation, efficiency. And the idea is that really this striving in this self-interested manner within a competitive rivalry are the sort of essential ingredients of competition. Now, what we get from these two ingredients, the assumption is progress, social advancement, an expanding economy, a drive for ever higher degrees of excellence and attainment, and these sorts of things. So progress is very, I would say, central to the modern conception of competition. But along with progress, of course, is the idea that competition ultimately results in winners and losers. Some people benefit more from this progress than others. Again, whether it's in the market or on the playing field or, frankly, in war or politics or in the court system or wherever else these contests are occurring. So I've come to understand that these sort of 4 factors I've put on the screen are really all integrated into the modern conception of competition. And of course, you can find narrow technical definitions maybe in certain specific fields that might look a little bit different than this, but I think this represents quite fairly the sort of modern mindset when it comes to competition. I would go further and also say that the way these factors interact both reflect and are a product of a larger worldview. And it's a worldview that basically sees society itself as an arena of contest. Essentially, this is the nature of our collective experience, is to exist in an arena of social contest. Now, if we go back again to the principle of oneness, we see really a fundamentally different understanding of the nature of society itself. Instead of thinking about society as an arena of social contest, we understand it really as a unified, organic body, a social body. And this phrase, social body, is a phrase that Abdu'l-Baha actually uses on a number of occasions when he's talking about oneness. So I'm going to use that on some occasions throughout this presentation. My reference to the social body is a reference to really the principle of the oneness of humanity. So we think about society as an interdependent social body, organically unified at this sort of deep level of our structures and our relationships. We can use that lens to look at then these sort of 4 factors, the 4 elements of competition, and see which ones are compatible at least on a sort of initial level. I think when we look carefully and thoughtfully, we can see that the idea of self-interested rivalry is fundamentally incompatible with the idea of society as a social body, an organic, unified body. If we just look at the human body as the example that Baha'u'llah uses in his own writings, we don't think of the relationship between the cells and organs in our own body in terms of a self-interested rivalry. That would be a really bizarre way to think about human health. It may be a useful way of thinking about certain disease conditions. In fact, Baha'u'llah often talks about the sort of diseased state of humanity or of society. And I think that would actually capture this idea of self-interested rivalry. But the conception of oneness that we're working towards seems incompatible with it. I think we could also generally agree that if one understands society as a social body, the idea of winners and losers also really is not compatible with that conception. Again, if you look at your own body, at the human body, we don't think about its internal parts in terms of winners and losers. A healthy body is a body in which all the cells, all the organs are healthy, productive, contributing, and benefiting members of that body. So in place of this self-interested rivalry, if we wanted to redraw this equation around the principle of oneness, I think we need to take the motives of self-interest and the relationship of rivalry and ultimately substitute it with actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's look at these two other elements that I have on the screen. Striving for excellence, creativity, and productivity. We can agree, I think, that this is an element that's certainly consistent with the oneness principle, the idea of a social body. I think we can also agree that progress is very consistent with this conception of a maturing or developing, progressing social body. But if we go now to this, the motives and the relationships attached with self-interested rivalries, I would suggest we need to really replace those with the idea of altruistic cooperation. This is the relationship that defines the internal members of a healthy body, working together in order to contribute to the benefit of everyone. And I think, again, if we replace this idea of winners and losers with the idea of collective prosperity, we're now getting closer to an equation that is compatible with the idea of society as a social body. But of course, that's not how competition is understood today. So, on this basic level, I think we could agree that the way competition is generally understood today doesn't seem to be compatible with the principle of oneness, the understanding of society as an organic body. Now, there was a letter that was written just a couple weeks ago after I signed up for the seminar, this webinar. It was written by the House of Justice to the Baha'is of Iran on March 2nd. It's really a remarkable letter. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to study that. I would venture to say that it's the most clear and concise and compelling overview of the essential elements of the conceptual framework guiding the Baha'i world right now in its work that the House of Justice has ever written. So I certainly commend it to your very careful study. Within that letter, there's a paragraph or a few paragraphs that explore the relationships that bind the individual, the community, and the institutions. And the House talks about how essentially previous historical understandings of these relationships have been inadequate. And what we're trying to do in the Baha'i world right now is enter into a learning mode where we're consciously and systematically exploring how to reinvent these relationships, how to renew and recreate these relationships. So I'm going to put this whole paragraph up. So it's in the context of this learning mode that the Baha'i world is part of, which most of you are very familiar with, I'm sure. I'll put this whole paragraph up, and I just want to let you read this on your own for a minute or two. It's kind of a dense and complex paragraph. So if you could take a minute to read this, then I'll talk about it in a minute. It'll give you a break from my voice. Okay, hopefully you've all had a chance to read through this and make sense of this paragraph. My understanding of what it's saying is essentially that if we understand society as a organic body, and we understand the individual and the institutions as members of that organic body, the community, which itself could be understood as a community, the relationships between those various actors, the individual, the institutions, and the community, ultimately we need to learn how to refashion those in a cooperative manner. That's my understanding, more or less, of what's being said here. And if it helps, just think about the individuals as cells in that body, and the institutions as its organs and structures, and the body as a community itself. Those are the relationships we're talking about. And the House of Justice says clearly cooperation is a principle that governs the functioning of such a system. So if we're trying to move toward a new world, if we're trying to recreate a social order along these lines, we need to ask ourselves, why is the ideology of competition so widely accepted today? Because this ideology is an obstacle, on the path that we're trying to walk together. Or another way of thinking about it is really it's an expression of immaturity, the immaturity of our collective past that we're trying to sort of grow beyond. But we need to think about, why is humanity sort of clinging to this ideology of competition so forcefully, so desperately? There's a very compelling book written a little over a decade ago by an author named Alfie Kohn, really exactly about this question. It was on the list of supplemental readings on the ABS webinar website for those of you who wanted to sort of dive deeply into this. So Alfie Kohn wrote a book, actually it's right here in case you want to see it. It's called No Contest, The Case Against Competition, Why We All Lose in Our Race to Win. And in that book, Alfie Kohn identifies what he considers 4 major myths that are used or invoked to sort of rationalize and perpetuate competition. I'm going to go through each one of these really quickly and talk about just how he sort of debunks them, but without spending too much time on it. So the first one of these myths that he talks about is the human nature myth. The myth that humans are just invariably competitive. In other words, competition is woven into our being, it's in our DNA, and we can't escape it. So how can you imagine, a social order that isn't founded on that? Now, what Alfie Kohn does is he does this big meta-analysis of hundreds of studies that basically dispel this myth. What the science shows is, mounting bodies of empirical evidence that show, of which he touches on some, that show that in fact humans are wired for both competition and cooperation, or both egoism and altruism, and which one of these becomes more fully expressed is really a function of our education and training, our socialization, our social environment, our life experiences, and of course on another level our free will and how we choose to act. Competition is not, competition clearly is a potential of human nature, but cooperation is an equally likely potential depending on essentially how we're raised and how we choose to live. So since Alfie Kohn wrote this book a little over a decade ago, large numbers of people are beginning to write about this, and assemble a very impressive sort of array of empirical data. Again, I threw a couple of titles up on the reading list for those you want to read more deeply, and I'll let you look at those yourself, and those don't even begin to scratch the surface of the literature in this area, which is basically debunked the idea that human natures are invariably competitive. It's just a myth. So the next myth that Alfie Kohn looks at is the idea that without competition we'll never achieve excellence and productivity or efficiency or any of those things that were part of that equation I talked about. The general idea is here, without competition we'll all just become lazy and characterized by mediocrity. And again, there's a lot of empirical evidence, some of which Alfie Kohn assembles, which show that this just isn't the case. Ultimately, this is a question of human motivations. What motivates us? The assumption underlying this myth is that unless we're motivated to compete, to win, at the expense of others, that we don't strive in these ways. And it just isn't the truth. There's no doubt that that's one form of human motivation. Like material acquisition, material accumulation, is certainly a drive that many humans respond to. but it's only one, and it appears not even to be the most powerful. Actually, altruism, contributing to the betterment of society, are equally, if not more powerful human motivations that are equally, if not more likely to lead to excellence and productivity. And I'll just put it to you, in the simplest way. How many people throughout history have literally sacrificed their lives to win a competition, to accumulate more stuff, to win a prize, to do these sorts of things? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many people who are driven by self-interested, materialistic sort of competitive motives to the extent that they would sacrifice their life to win those contests. On the other hand, if we ask how many people throughout history have been willing to sacrifice their lives to contribute to the betterment of humanity, what we see actually is, among other things, religious history is filled with people who not only have done that but continue to do that today. We also see most of the great social movements of the last few centuries, the abolition of slavery, the achievement of women's suffrage, and other movements of these kinds, characterized by people, again, who are willing to sacrifice their life. So when it comes to these questions of human motivation and the sort of sources of excellence and productivity and innovation and social change and progress, the myth just doesn't hold up. Another myth that Alfie Kohn debunks is the pleasure myth, or the idea that competition is the only way to have fun. We think of all the forms of recreation and leisure that we engage in, at least in many parts of the world today, that are competitive, and it shouldn't be surprising that we associate competition with fun. But again, the myth doesn't hold up to the empirical evidence. There are all sorts of ways to have fun, to engage in pleasure that are not competitive. Many of us engage in them and without even maybe necessarily recognizing this. It's also important to point out that, in all honesty, winning might be fun, but losing isn't particularly fun, and most people can't win in all the contests that are arranged in the modern world. So I won't spend a whole lot more time on this. Again, I turn you towards Alfie Kohn's treatment, in which he devotes a whole chapter to debunking this myth based on the empirical evidence that's available. The fourth myth that he looks at is what he calls the character myth. It's the idea that competition builds character. It's what makes us, strong and independent and, these sorts of things. Well, again, the empirical evidence just doesn't support it. In fact, it supports exactly the opposite. What competition tends to breed is self-centered behavior and egotistical behavior. And in fact, just look at the sports world over the last decade, and what we see is, as in competition becomes increasingly acute, we see more and more people driven to extremes, extreme forms of cheating and, other things that are actually the exact opposite of the kind of characters we hope to build in ourselves. So again, the myth just doesn't hold up. Alfie Kohn goes into a lot more depth in looking at this. Now, I want to add one more myth that Alfie Kohn just touches on kind of indirectly, but I think it's very central to sort of rationalizing the ideology of competition. And it's the survival of the fittest myth. It's the idea that, well, biological evolution was characterized by competition, and that's why, the fittest always survived, and the people or the species that were less fit perished, and so that's what drove biological evolution, was competition. And since it drove biological evolution, surely it must drive social evolution. But there are two major problems with this myth. The first is society doesn't necessarily function the same way as biology. It's a system on a different level, so to speak, and equating biological competition with social dynamics, that's social Darwinism. There's some pretty profound flaws in logic to that thinking. But actually, much more importantly, is the fact that evolutionary biologists are beginning to understand now that biological evolution itself is not a fundamentally competitive process. And in fact, mutualism and symbiosis of all kinds are fundamental to driving biological evolution. And in this context, what a lot of evolutionary scientists are beginning to accept is that survival of the fittest in many ways actually means survival of the mutualist. You know, from the first nucleated cells that all advanced life forms share, we're now beginning to understand that those nucleated cells are actually emerged from two different cells that entered into a symbiotic relationship and merged and became integrated as a single cell. Every cell in your body is of that kind. It's actually two different species coexisting in a mutualistic way. Aside from that, we can look at all the other species that exist even in your own body, in your digestive tract, literally hundreds of thousands or millions actually of other species coexisting with you, benefiting from you, but also contributing to your health and well-being. That's mutualism. Virtually every plant that has a root system benefits from mutualistic relations in the soil ecosystem. In fact, all plants and animals exist in a mutualistic relationship that Abdu'l-Baha himself comments on, in which plants depend for animals on carbon dioxide, and the reverse is true, and the balance in our atmosphere is fundamentally a mutualistic balance between these two kingdoms of life. And we could go on to look at social species which have taken cooperation to a whole nother level. Ants, bees, wolves, primates. The reason these species have been so fit to survive is because they've taken cooperation to unprecedented levels. And of course the human species has taken cooperation to an even more unprecedented level, which is fundamentally what explains our remarkable fitness and success as a species. So there's a lot of literature emerging around this. I won't spend any more time on this, but essentially we can debunk the idea that social competition is necessary because it somehow reflects biological dynamics, evolutionary dynamics. It's simply not the case. So having debunked all those myths, it's worth also stopping to reflect for a second on, well, why is this ideology so widely accepted today? It might have something to do with whose interests does this ideology serve. We need to just be clear here and frank, I think, and recognize the fact that when social institutions and social relationships are organized as contests, what you're doing is you're privileging people who enter those contests with the biggest advantages. Most contests ultimately are contests of power of one kind or another. Physical strength, financial power, status, these sorts of things. So when you organize society as an arena of contest, what you're basically doing is serving the interests of the most powerful segments of society, or those segments who have inherited the most power. This is the world we live in today. This is what the ideology of contest serves, ultimately. We also can stop and reflect for a second, beyond just these myths that are used to rationalize, how are these myths themselves perpetuated? How is the ideology perpetuated? So very quickly, I think we need to recognize, on the simplest level, one of the major factors is just naive ignorance, just people blindly imitating the way their parents and grandparents and the society around them has acted. Abdu'l-Baha talks about this repeatedly, the sort of ultimate oppression of this kind of blind imitation and ignorance. This is how children learn, through imitation. So if the generation before them is engaging in competitive ways, it shouldn't be surprising that children are just sort of naively internalizing those modes of behavior. But beyond that, we need to also add that in many parts of the world today, our education systems and other processes of socialization are actually formally and intentionally structured to foster competition. I went through a K-12 school and on to a university education that required me to compete on some sort of bell curve for the best, grades and the most recognition, and that was a requirement of participation. It's built in. It's fostered in us, which kind of raises an interesting point. If human beings are invariably competitive, why do we need to invest so much time educating ourselves and socializing ourselves to be competitive. I think actually what it shows is we're investing all that energy to draw out one possible form of human behavior over another. Beyond that, I think we also need to recognize that we've established entire industries, media industries and other culture industries, that actually foster cultivation and cultivate the ideology of competition for profit. Just think about commercial media, whose business model is basically to manufacture audiences and sell them to advertisers for at the lowest possible cost for the maximum profit. Well, the most successful way to do that is by filling television screens and other screens with a lot of violence, conflict, and competition. It's cheap spectacle. And by essentially saturating our media environment, our cultural environment, with those commercial forms of cheap spectacle, we're further reinforcing this ideology of competition, because it just appears more and more natural as we see it everywhere we look. We could add to that then the fact that we have a range of institutional structures that also require us, if we want to participate in those structures, require us to behave in competitive ways. So, for instance, if we think about our systems of governance, partisan, politics, for instance, it's structured as a contest. If you want to play, you have to play that way, right? Or we can think about the legal systems in many parts of the world today. The legal adversary system in, the sort of Anglo-American tradition is the extreme example, but any advocacy-based system is actually ultimately a form of this. If you want to play, you have to engage in the contest. It requires that of us. We could say the same thing about the capitalist economy that dominates the world today. If you want to play in the modern economy, you have to play in a competitive manner. It basically requires that of us. And of course, the educational system I already referred to. We could add to this, institutions around recreation and leisure and other areas. But the bottom line is, to participate in most modern institutions, you have to adopt a competitive mode, even if you choose not to participate in them. If you're just observing them, you're observing people engaging in competitive mode. It's normalizing and naturalizing those kinds of behavior, which further perpetuates and reinforces this ideology of competition. So I'm going to wind down in a few minutes. The last thing I want to do is focus in briefly on 3 of these areas of contest, which I think are really sort of crucial to look at their relationship, to understand, first of all, again, why is this culture being perpetuated, but also why is it fundamentally incompatible with the principle of oneness, which kind of brings us, fully back to the question we started with. So if we look at these 3 systems, the first thing I want to point out is, even though you can analyze each one of these as independent systems, they overlap in complex ways. And on that level, we can actually understand them as sort of a single integrated system that has 3 parts, or what I refer to in my writings as the tripartite system of contests, a 3-part system of contests. So if we analyze these as really a single overlapping system in which, for instance, governance shapes the legal system and the economy, even as the economy shapes governance and the legal system, and right, we see these interrelationships. If we analyze them in this way, the first thing I think we need to recognize is most thoughtful citizens of the world today would like to assume that ultimately governance needs to sort of set the rules for instance, the legal system and our economy, right? That governance is a system in which people come together and hopefully act in just and responsible ways, pass laws, and engage in forms of enforcement that regulate and stabilize and make as healthy and productive as possible the legal system and the economy. The problem, though, when you structure all 3 of these systems as contests, is actually what you do is you subordinate governance to the economy itself. So the reasons for this are fairly simple. political contests are expensive to win. Any of you who've watched, certainly American politics and partisan politics in other parts of the world, you see the same thing. It takes money to win a successful political campaign. You either have to have the money yourself, or you need access to people who are willing to finance your campaign for, in order to advance their own interests. So political contests are expensive, so are legal contests. Hiring the best, legal advocates is an expensive undertaking. The fact that contests in each of these spheres are expensive means basically that the winners in the economic contests have powerful advantages in the contests over governance and law. So this is why a tripartite system like this inevitably subordinates governance and law to the outcomes of economic competition. You cannot avoid this point. If these systems are structured as contests, you cannot avoid this problem of subordinating governance and law to the economy. Now, when this happens, when they are subordinate in these ways, it results in a whole host of social injustices and environmental problems of all kinds we see in the world today. This sort of increasing gap between the richest and poorest members of society, the degradation of ecosystems and habitats, and even ultimately the entire atmosphere and climate. These are natural outcomes of this tripartite system of contests, for reasons I go into in much more depth, in my book and in other writings. But by virtue of the injustices and environmental problems that flow from this, I'm not sure why that just happened. Hold on a sec, let me get to the next slide. Okay, this tripartite system of contests is itself associated with a culture of protest that flows naturally from it, right? The injustices that are created by this tripartite system lead naturally to people organizing in opposition to it. And so we have in all parts of the world today, on a daily basis, expressions of opposition and protest, often rooted in very genuine, sincere, thoughtful motives, sometimes in more selfish and ingenuine motives. But the culture of protest is ultimately one and the same. It's woven into the fabric of this tripartite system. And it's these elements together that I'm referring to as the culture of contest. Okay, this tripartite system, or the organization of primary social institutions as contests, surrounded by a culture of protest, is this sort of dominating culture of contest that we live in the world. Now, I live in the United States. You could say it's kind of the epicenter of this culture, but most other countries today, certainly in the Western world, share most of the underlying sort of characteristics by degrees, and processes of globalization have been exporting these same sort of structures and relationships all over the world today. So this is the culture of contest. Now, ultimately, if we step back and sort of think in a bird's eye view at this culture of contest, we can see that it reflects a fundamentally materialistic understanding of reality. The assumptions about human nature are fundamentally materialistic. The assumptions about the social order are fundamentally materialistic. In the mid-90s, the House of Justice commissioned a document that many of you have probably read, called The Prosperity of Humankind. In that document, there's a paragraph that speaks exactly to this relationship I'm talking about. The fact that this culture of contest reflects and derives from an essentially materialistic interpretation of reality. So I'll just give you a minute to read this paragraph again. It'll give you a break from my voice, and you can see what I'm talking about here. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to read that. So if we accept this premise that competition, the ideology of competition, the social forms that it takes, represent a basically immature, materialistic understanding of life. And the question is, where do we go from here? How do we move beyond this culture of contest? Obviously, that's a huge discussion. It's a complex project. This is, a large part of what the Baha'i community is engaged in through the global plans of the faith, but also what many thoughtful citizens and groups around the world are trying to learn how to do. To put this movement in its broadest perspective, I want to end with a brief reference to a concept that Abdu'l-Baha emphasizes in some of his writings, which is the concept of the arc of ascent. It actually goes much deeper into like Islamic philosophy is where this concept comes from, if I understand correctly. But Abdu'l-Baha talks about this arc of ascent. And he talks about how at the sort of lowest point of the arc of ascent, or the arc of descent, he sometimes says, is essentially material reality. And at the highest point of this arc of ascent is spiritual reality. And at the movement, Abdu'l-Baha says, from material realities to spiritual realities is a movement from contest and competition to cooperation and reciprocity. So here we see Abdu'l-Baha says the arc of descent ends in materialities, and the arc of descent ends in materialities, and the arc of ascent ends in spiritualities. The higher a kingdom of created things is on the arc of ascent, the more conspicuous are the signs and evidences of the truth that cooperation and reciprocity at the level of a higher order are greater than those that exist at the level of a lower order. And he also says, thus when contemplating the human world, thou beholdest this wondrous phenomenon shining resplendent from all sides with the utmost perfection. The more this interrelationship, he's talking here about the interrelationship of cooperation and reciprocity, that form of relationship, the more this interrelationship is strengthened and expanded, the more will human society advance in progress and prosperity. So I think this question we started with, is competition compatible with the principle of oneness? If our movement is towards ever higher degrees of spiritual attainment that are characterized by the oneness of humanity, then I think the answer to that question has to be no. Competition is fundamentally incompatible with the principle of oneness. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I've gone on quite long enough, and if there are questions, then I'll do what I can to answer them, or comments, and I think our ABS moderator, Neelafar, will post those. Okay, so we have a question from Lawrence Miller, who asks, isn't the issue of competition versus cooperation a false dichotomy? In sports, for example, there's a high level of cooperation, both between teams and within teams, while there's also high competition. I guess I would understand this a little bit differently. Again, I would think about not so much a dichotomy, but a continuum. We can think about relationships on one end of a continuum or another end of a continuum. And my understanding is that what we're being asked to do at this time in human history is to move consciously and purposefully from the competitive end of that continuum towards a cooperative end of that continuum. I would agree that certainly in a lot of sports you have cooperation within a team in order to compete against other teams. The same is true in the business world. You have cooperation within a company so that they can compete with other companies. What I'm suggesting, though, is that those competitive relationships are ultimately limiting human progress, and that we need to figure out ways to move beyond those. Now, will that be as essential in every sphere of human activity? I don't know. Is there a legitimate space for competition in sports? Maybe. What I'm arguing against, though, is a culture in which every major social institution is organized in fundamentally competitive ways. And in that context, sports is just one of dozens of reinforcing social institutions that become highly problematic in that context. What does the future hold in that regard? I can't say exactly, but my understanding is that we're being asked to move very consciously and very purposefully towards the cooperative end of that continuum. Maybe the next question. I'm sure there's more that could be said on that, but let's go ahead and try the next question now. I think that's the one I just did. Okay, so Sue asks, wouldn't the concepts of cooperation and reciprocity be more conducive to the principle of oneness than competition? Absolutely, and I think I've ended my presentation on that note. My guess is that this question was asked kind of before I got into that territory. Let's go ahead with the next question. Oh, if you could advance, yeah. All right, so Sarah asks, what is a Baha'i view on the cooperatives model of business? I attended the International Year of Cooperatives in Quebec City. Curious if Baha'is prefer this model to traditional capitalism. I don't know that there's an official Baha'i view on cooperatives. I certainly personally think it's a model that we should experiment with and be aware of and support in various ways. I'm involved in a very successful cooperative in my local community that's thriving, and it's demonstrating a very viable model. Will all economic ventures, in the future in some sort of ideal Baha'i world be cooperatives? I'm not sure that that'd be the case. I don't think we'll know what they'll look like. What I will suggest, though, is we need to get busy reinventing, the concept of the modern corporation. And my guess is there'll be many forms that it can take, one of which may be the cooperative sort of form you're talking about, which doesn't just mean highly cooperative sort of relationships. Cooperative here means a very specific business model. But I think we very much need to reinvent the corporation as we understand it, because if a corporation's primary objective is to accumulate wealth for its owners, that's not fundamentally compatible with the idea of an organic social body. There are limits to the accumulation of wealth, and of course to how wealth is accumulated. So we have, certainly with public traded companies, corporations in the world today, structural incentives that actually work against those moderating forces. So I guess in response to this, I would say I think cooperatives are an important experiment, an important model we should be familiar with and support and learn about. But beyond that, we need to probably try many diverse sort of forms of economic incorporation in order to learn, really, what do economic institutions need to look like, how do they need to function in a unified social body. Aryan asks, how do we implement cooperation within the competitive institutes or culture of contest and not suffer when all who are in these institutes are competing? That's a really good question. I think I would say maybe two things. One is, the kind of changes that we're asked to bring about require sacrifice. That's pretty clear from the Baha'i writings, that fundamental change requires sacrifice, and there may be situations where we need to actually sacrifice, where we may not be able to be as successful as we're trying to learn how to do things differently. But actually beyond that, I also want to point out that there's a lot of evidence emerging that I'm seeing that actually, as we move in more competitive or away from competitive models towards cooperative and collaborative models, even in the economic arena, it actually is attracting success. So if we just think about survival of the fittest as not a competitive dynamic but a mutualistic dynamic, the same, I would argue, is true in economic sphere, that we need to learn the ways of cooperation and mutualism that actually are successful. And I'm aware of one group of Baha'is and other like-minded people who are really trying to push the boundaries of this. A small enterprise called Second Muse that's trying to really make a business model out of collaboration, and they're having incredible success. They can't even grow fast enough to keep up with the demand for their services. So on one hand, again, to recap, I think sometimes we need to be willing to sacrifice, but on the other, I think we need to be confident that if we move towards higher degrees of cooperation and mutualism in every sphere, including the economic sphere, that ultimately that will attract success of various kinds. Okay, so Solomon asks, do you have some practical tips how we can help people, students excel without promoting competition? Again, it comes back to the problem of, how do you perform within structures that require competition? Unfortunately, the world is filled with such structures. I mean, this is why Shugafindi calls us children of the half-light, right? Because we're stuck with one foot in that world. And I don't think there's any, simple sort of solutions to that. I think we need to continually be searching, trying, experimenting on ways to move away from that end of the continuum. Sometimes there'll be penalties and consequences we face, but other times I think actually we'll find that it attracts success and confirmations. I don't know if that's practical enough. I think this is a big discussion. This is a discussion we need to be having. It's one of the, so let's step back to this learning mode we're trying to develop, this culture of learning, this systematic process of action, reflection, consultation. We should be having these discussions with the people around us, with our fellow students. We should be trying things, reflecting on them, adjusting our approaches as we essentially trying to learn how to do this. Okay, let's go to the next slide. If there is a next slide. Okay, Barbara asks, please talk about the human propensity for ownership in this context. Well, that's a good question. I don't think there's any philosophical argument against ownership and property rights in some contexts. I certainly have never seen anything in the Baha'i writings that would suggest also that the concept of ownership has no validity, like some versions of Marxism would suggest. But I do think what's relevant here is the need to moderate accumulation. So how much do we own? How much property do we need? If we just think again within the human body, how many nutrients does any given organ need? Because beyond that, it's actually unhealthy both for the organ and for the body. And the principle, I think, is exactly the same here. So how much do we need is a relevant question. And the principles of moderation and justice and these sorts of things and awareness of the health of the entire social body are the principles that allow us to navigate that question. Okay, next slide. So Ian asks, how do you see it possible to eliminate competition from national governance? Well, let me start by rephrasing that question and ask rhetorically, is it possible to keep competition in governance and survive as a species? I mean, are we actually, is it effective? Are we managing our affairs? I can tell you, living in the United States, which obviously has a model of national governance organized in a competitive manner, I would say we've essentially become ungovernable at the federal level, basically incapable of making important decisions, incapable of doing simple things like balancing a budget, incapable of investing in education, infrastructure, in the future in any way. So I would say that in fact our only choice is to figure out how to eliminate competition from national governance if we want to survive and thrive as a species. and then the question is how. I think we can look to the early experience of the Baha'i community and the model of electoral model that we have been developing as some of the broad contours of model of national governance. What distinguishes the Baha'i electoral system is that it is 100% free of competition. Like, that is, in my mind, the distinguishing feature of the Baha'i electoral process. And it has proven itself to be viable in every culture on earth. There's no people anywhere that hasn't learned how to use that system. On the other hand, we're still somewhat immature in how we use it. I mean, the culture of the Baha'i community is still developing, and the system only works as well as our sort of level of cultural advancement supports the structure of this system. And the same certainly would be true at the level of a nation state. You could never impose the Baha'i electoral system on an existing nation. It would be a disaster, because the maturity of the individual voting, of the individual voters, and the culture that needs to support it needs to be built. And that's why in the Baha'i community we don't just focus on either building structures or changing human culture and consciousness. We realize both have to happen simultaneously. So what I would say is we already know that there are electoral models that work free from competition, and we know that human culture and human consciousness can develop in ways that support those models, and that in the long run this is what we need to be moving towards at the level of national governance, developing similar structures and cultures that support them. Okay, Nushin asks, how to perform parenting a child being educated in a competitive world, how to help him survive, beholding humbleness and cooperation while assessments are based on being competitive. This is again one of those really challenging aspects of living in a modern world, a world that is racked by disease, by social disease, as Baha'u'llah said. So we're living in a diseased world. These are some of the diseases that we're grappling with. It can be heart-wrenching for parents to see their children go out in these, some of their children who are strong and, in various ways succeed in various contests, and their parents may not notice these problems, but most children go out into the world and actually don't have such positive experiences, and there's just a world of suffering out there on account of this. Children that basically limit their own potential in their own minds by very early ages because of these sorts of problems. How do we as a parent deal with this? Well, sometimes we can seek out educational systems that actually aren't competitive. I was fortunate enough to have an affordable Montessori school in my town. Both of my daughters went through. They never saw a grade until they were teenagers and transferred into other schools. And Montessori isn't the perfect system, but it is not a competitive system. There are no grades, no bell curves. Most of the kids going through that system maintain a love of learning that most of my daughter's peers in the traditional school systems had lost early on in their experience. So sometimes there are simple things we can do, but beyond that, I guess we need to try and raise our children's consciousness so that they can see beyond the structures that they're operating in, that they're living in, and that they can transcend them and dedicate their lives to building a world in which every generation won't be sort of burdened with the same obstacles. Okay, Kay asks, what about healthy competition that is more like a motivator to achieve excellence at school, for example? Well, so I guess what I would say is this assumes there is such a thing as healthy competition. I'm not convinced that there is. There may be. I'm not certainly all-knowing about these things. I can say, based on the evidence I've seen, I haven't actually seen a strong argument or solid empirical evidence for the idea of healthy competition. I think many people are able to compete in healthy ways, but I'm not sure they wouldn't do even better under other circumstances. So, and in terms of achieving excellence at school, if by excellence at school we mean getting top grades, that's one thing. If by excellence at school we mean expanding our mind, deepening our insight, developing a thirst and a love for learning that'll carry throughout our lives, I'm not sure that competition contributes anything to those outcomes. Okay, Anise asks, in your opinion, what do formal educational institutions and individuals within it have in moving society towards mutualism, reciprocity, and cooperation? Particularly, how, as a budding communication scholar, can I contribute to the movement? Well, okay, so here the good news is there is a very strong movement in these directions. You know, I've got a school of education on my campus, teachers being trained there. Generally speaking, most of the professors I talk to in the School of Education are always trying to move towards more cooperative and more collaborative models of learning. I mean, the cutting edge of educational theory and practice is that students learn best in cooperative and collaborative ways, and that also they need to learn how to cooperate and collaborate to succeed in life. So there's a lot of emphasis in this direction by thoughtful educators. The sad thing is a lot of those thoughtful educators are stuck within structures that still require them to do the opposite. I mean, I myself come to work every day. I teach classes at the university. I'm required to assign students grades on, you know, some sort of bell curve or some reasonable distribution that I think is philosophically unsound. It's one of the most unpleasant and problematic parts of my job. But I can't just ignore it. It's one of the rules of the game in the structure that I work within. So again, sometimes we can look for or create structures that don't require this. And I've given the one example of the Montessori school. There are some programs at some universities that are moving away from grade-based education. They're rare. But sometimes we work within those structures and we have to essentially do the best we can to promote cooperation and reciprocity within a structure that otherwise is incompatible on some level. But I think there are a lot of people who are striving to move in this direction at every level, K to 12, university, you know, education, and so forth. All right, Sue asks, what might cooperation and mutualism look like in the arena of neighborhood social action to avoid feelings of estrangement towards an illusionary other or nurturing instinct? So let me just read this again. Okay, so if I understand the question, I guess what I could say is, you know, at the neighborhood level, when we think about social action, you know, other work, relationships we're forming, here I think it should really become probably very obvious that we're trying to build community neighborhood by neighborhood, sort of from the ground up, often rebuild community, because frankly, in most parts of the world, you know, community is disintegrated long ago. Certainly in the areas I live, there's no sense of community in most neighborhoods. People are isolated and often suspicious, you know, go home and close their door and that's it. I think clearly to rebuild the kind of neighborhood fabric that we need to be building, we can only do that in a cooperative and mutualistic mode. You know, we fundamentally need to be establishing relationships of trust and mutual assistance. We need to be able to help one another. We need to reach out to one another when you know, when we need help, but also be attentive to those people who need these helps. And obviously, we need to do this within our capacity. We can't meet every need. We can't tend to every, you know, every problem or every illness. But really, fundamentally, this is the web of community. Cooperation is really almost synonymous with community. So, and this idea of the other, maybe this is something also implied by this question, if I understand it correctly. This is something I think Baha'is need to especially think very long and hard about. You know, we're trying to create a world characterized by oneness. by a common sense of humanity, understanding the oneness of humanity. Sometimes when I'm in discussions with people who are trying to understand this concept, they say, well, what about Baha'is? Isn't that just another identity in opposition to people who are not Baha'i? Isn't this just another other? Here I think we need to really think carefully about this. My understanding is that we need to understand the difference between a primary and a secondary identity. Our primary identities is as members of humanity, members of the body of humanity. That's our primary, fundamental, foundational identity, within which every other identity we hold is secondary. Because that primary identity accommodates all sorts of secondary identities, as long as those secondary identities are not competitive and adversarial. So I'm a human first. I also happen to be a Baha'i, and I happen to be a woodworker and a professor, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I have all these other identities, all of which are subordinate and secondary to my fundamental human identity. And that includes my Baha'i identity. The interesting thing about the Baha'i identity is its sole purpose is to promote the primary human identity, right? But we do that by subordinating even our Baha'i identity to the oneness of humanity. So as we engage in others in our neighborhoods, I think we need to be very careful not to create a sort of Baha'i, non-Baha'i sort of oppositional identity, a competitive or adversarial identity, or this idea of, that others are less than or inferior to us, and in any way like that. The reason we're Baha'i is to submerge our Baha'i identity in the oneness of humanity, and to invite others, whatever their background, Baha'i or not, to do the same. So that's, I guess, also how I would understand this question. Let's go to the next one. If there is another question. All right, last question coming up. All right, John from Toowoomba, Australia. What a great name for a city. Okay, John asks, as long as there's private property which is upheld by Baha'u'llah. Oh, we just went off the slide. Could you bring that back, Nilufar? As long as there's private property which is upheld by Baha'u'llah, then there will inevitably be some degree of competition, given that human beings are imperfect. It seems to me that the key issue is the development of the moral capacities of the individual. Adam Smith recognized this to some degree in his theory of moral sentiments. A change in social structures can change the environment in which these moral capacities can develop. Interested in your comments? I agree entirely. So, first of all, I mentioned earlier that private property seems to be something that we can be comfortable with, but it has to be understood within moderation. So it's the excessive accumulation of property we're concerned about, or excessive deprivation, right, when it comes to property. That's what we're fundamentally concerned about. And the way we moderate those is by thinking about what does the entire social body need. So as a member of society, how much do I need to be contributing to the well-being of the rest of the body? Within that framework, I think we can agree that because ultimately we have this animal nature that we always struggle with, that there'll be some degree of competition in human affairs. In other words, we'll always be struggling to overcome this. It's the same as saying, will we ever be like free from the ego or free from the promptings of the insistent self? No. We will always be. Abdu'l-Baha says that love of self, this insistent self, is kneaded into the clay of man. It will always be here. We'll always be struggling with it. But what we don't want to do is embrace it. We don't want to say, oh, I feel these selfish impulses, therefore that must be the way I'm supposed to behave, and that must be the way everybody should behave. So let's just structure society as a set of contests in which we all give free rein to our selfish impulses. That's the world we live in today. Literally, the sort of vice of ego and self-interest has been transformed into a virtue in many ideologies and in many philosophies. So what I'm saying is, yeah, ego, competition, selfish motives, we'll always be struggling with them. They'll always be present. They're not just going to sort of disappear, magically in some future social order we're creating. But like you've said, we can create structures, institutional structures that foster and reward competition, and that don't foster and that foster and reward cooperation, and that don't foster and reward competition. We can create educational systems that foster and cultivate cooperative and mutualistic relationships, and that don't foster competitive ones. And then, of course, ultimately, we need to turn inward as individuals and engage in practices, prayer, meditation, fasting, and striving to serve and align our lives, calling ourselves to account each day. All of these spiritual disciplines are ultimately, in my understanding, designed in part to help us struggle against these selfish and competitive impulses, which will never leave us, but which we don't have to feed. We don't have to give into, and we can actually overcome to remarkable degrees. So absolutely, I think competition will always be around as a temptation or an instinct, but when I look at the world around and many of the people I'm surrounded with, I'm awestruck by the extent to which they've subordinated those impulses to higher impulses in their lives. And that's the world we're trying to create, along with structures that reinforce those sort of levels of consciousness. So I think we need to wrap up. I just want to thank you all for being very patient with my long-winded presentation, and I want to emphasize that all of my opinions really are very sort of reflect very personal understandings and insights, and I would hope you test and challenge and think beyond what I've said, and invite you to engage in conversation in the futures about this. So thank you.